Well, nothing makes you feel more successful than laughing at other people's failures. Can we all agree? My name is Bronson, and I think the reason that we enjoy laughing at other people's failures is because our life is actually so full of failures that it's nice to be able to focus on someone else's from time to time. I was thinking about the different compartments of my life, and I was able to easily make a list of failures. Maybe you can relate to some of these. I think about the marriage department, how many times I've dropped the ball on a special occasion. There are some anniversary trips that still haven't been fulfilled in my life. When it comes to parenting, I like to call myself Father of the Year. That's a sarcastic term I gave to myself because of the many times that I have let my kids down. In one particular instance, my daughter several years ago was jumping on the trampoline and she started crying hysterically, and I was like, "What's wrong?" And she said, "My leg hurts," and I picked her up and calmed her down, and I was like, "You're fine, everything's good." Every time she would stand up, she would cry again, and I would check her out, and I would say, "Hallie, there's nothing wrong with you, stop crying. You've got to be tough." I pride myself in teaching my kids to be tough, right? My wife was like, "I'm gonna take her to the doctor," and I'm like, "Stop pandering these kids, you're wasting money." So I'm out in the yard, doing some yard work, and she comes back home with news that for the next couple of months, I get to carry my daughter around because she had legit broken her leg and had a cast all the way up to her hip. Even more fun was an Easter egg hunt where I got to pull her in a wagon. That was great. That was awesome. I felt really good about myself on that. I also thought about finances. We all have financial failures. Anyone else bought a $3,500 vacuum cleaner? It's for a good reason. Really? If you did, Yeah? No? I don't know. Me either. I thought about the fact that my wife literally hides the kids' snacks from me and thought I may have an issue with my health. And then, even spiritually, I have failures. Several months ago, I had a friend who had asked me to help him pray about an issue in his life, and it occurred to me that I had not fasted about this issue. I'd been praying with this friend for several months, and I grew up, my parents taught me to fast. Fasting is when you go without food so that you can concentrate on prayer for a specific need. And so I told my friend that I was gonna fast for 3 days, 3 whole days, no food. I was gonna cry out to God on his behalf. He could count on me. And so I went all Friday with no food. That was great. And then Saturday, I took my daughter to a playhouse. And on the way home, I was going to get her supper. My wife was out of town, actually. And so we stopped at Chick-fil-A, got some grilled chicken nuggets, some mac and cheese, some sweet tea. Stopped at Sam's on the way home, had to get some toilet paper. Got her a pretzel as well. And we got home, and she only ate like 2 of those nuggets, and you can't waste money, And it was just like calling my name, and I was like, "I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. My friend's going to be able to count on me." And guys, literally within 10 minutes, I had to eat the rest of the nuggets, all the mac and cheese, the pretzel, 2 donuts that were left over from the morning before, and I realized that I had just cursed my friend. Hopefully, God didn't see it that way, but I just really felt the weight of failure in that moment, specifically that even the things that I set my mind to do, I always find ways to come up short of those things. And so today, I actually want to talk to us about the role of failure in success. We're in this series called Success. We've been asking 2 specific questions throughout this series. First is, how do you define success? And the second one is, who gave you that definition? And while we've all agreed that we can define success differently, and we got our definitions of success differently, it's important to note that we all recognize when we fail. It's not hard to determine when we fail and carry the weight of that. Now, sometimes we're able to laugh at our failures. For instance, my dad several weeks ago wore 2 different shoes to work. You maybe have done this before. And literally no one noticed, and he'd gone half a day, and so he had to snap a picture and send it out to our family we're 2 different. And so I talked to him on the phone, and he literally went out into his office, and he would say to guys "Hey, do you know anything unusual about me? And they would be like, no. And he would be like, I have 2 different shoes on. Like, he just wanted people to notice his failures. And at times, we like to laugh about our failures, but honestly, there's times in our lives where we fail and we feel the weight of it, and we carry that weight with us throughout life. And those are the types of failures that I want to talk about specifically today. Because I believe that your relationship with failure deeply impacts your pursuit of success. Your relationship with failure deeply impacts your pursuit of success. I'm going to share with you this morning my greatest failure in life and ministry to date, because there's always tomorrow. But I want to share with you a significant failure in my life in hopes to help you identify a way forward when you face failures of your own. November 1st, 1987, I was privileged to begin a relationship with Jesus at an early age. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents took me to church, and I'm honestly really grateful that I've been following Jesus for most all of my life. When I got to high school, I began to look at biblical heroes of the faith, characters in the Bible, in admiration, and they were literal heroes to me. Like, I would look at Moses and be like, man, he led the children of Israel out of slavery, he parted the Red Sea. That must have been incredible. I would look at Noah, he saved the animal kingdom single-handedly. That's awesome. I would look at King David, who slayed Goliath and cut off his head with a sword. And I was just like, man, that would be awesome to do things like that for God. And I went to the New Testament, and I would think about Peter, who stood up on the day of Pentecost and proclaimed the good news of Jesus, and literally 3,000 people were added to the church that day. I mean, the Apostle Paul, all the things that he did, literally half of our New Testament are letters that he wrote to churches in his day, and I just thought, man, that is incredible. And so I began to kind of have this mantra for my life. And the mantra for my life was, I want to do great things for God. Like, I want to get to the end of my life, and I want people to look at all the things that I have done for God and celebrate it, because I just thought it would be so cool to be used by God in really powerful ways and significant ways. So I went to college, my freshman year of college. I didn't really know what I wanted to do outside of make a lot of money, and so I went to an engineering school, and during my freshman year, I was invited to be a chaperone for my home church's youth group on a fall retreat. And at that fall retreat, I specifically felt called by God into full-time ministry to be a preacher. And most specifically, I had a vision of myself literally standing on a stage proclaiming the news of Jesus to a large room. And so I transferred to a Christian college, got a degree in biblical studies. A month later, started in student ministry. And for 8 years, I served students. And really felt like God really blessed that season of my life, and things were going well. And then I began to have this dream to start a church. I couldn't shake it. Like, I would just think about it all the time. Like, I need to start a church. I want to start a church. I would think about what I was going to name the church. I would think all the details, how the church would be run. But there was a problem. My wife didn't share that dream. And so obviously I wasn't going to start a church without my wife agreeing that that would be a wise decision for us. And I will never forget coming home from a conference one weekend, at the conference again, feeling like God was just saying, you need to plant this church. You need to plant a church is church talk for start a church. Sorry if I say that. You need to start this church. And I walked in the door that weekend from the conference, and before we even called up, my wife kind of in tears was just like, hey, I've been praying this weekend, and I really feel like God wants us to start this church. And I'm sorry I've been hesitant, but let's do it. We're all aboard. And it was one of the most significant points in my marriage, honestly. The two of us so united, we were going to do this thing for God, and God was going to bless it, and it was going to be amazing. We're going to do great things for God. And so we began to raise money, and we went to some trainings to learn how to start a church. We began to recruit a core team that would help us start this church. And on January the 22nd, 2012, we launched our church for the first ever service, and 275 people showed up. And I thought, this is going to be awesome. I was on top of the world, 275 people showed up. It's going to be great. A couple of Easters later, we had 361 people show up to our Easter service. And I was able to stand in front of them and proclaim the good news of Jesus, and 30 people made decisions to follow Jesus that day. It was the first time in my life when I look back at that picture that I could really see God's vision for my life coming to fruition. Like, I was starting to see these crowds, and honestly, I thought I was going to be the next megachurch pastor. I just thought, it won't be long. I'll be invited to conferences. I'll be a household name, and everybody will be like reading my books and stuff. But little did I know that would be the largest crowd I would ever preach to at that church. And then it was downhill from there. And almost 5 years after we started the church, August of 2016, I was laying in bed with my wife at night, just talking about how the church was going. It's been almost 5 years. We're still portable. We haven't been able to create these environments that we envision. And I began to have this burden for my kids. We had just had our third child. And I began to ask my wife this question: how long are we going to hold on to this dream and allow our kids to grow up in a church that we don't envision them growing up in? So we haven't been able to create the environments that we want our kids to experience. We haven't been able to give them the experiences that we dream of them having in church. I mean, what if it takes another 10 years for us to feel like this thing is successful? 2 of our kids will be out of the house. They will have never experienced church the way we designed it or envisioned it. So we made a tough decision that at the end of that year, unless God did a miracle, we were going to close our church down because we wanted what was best for our kids. And when we felt like our own church wasn't best for our kids, we knew it was time to kind of move on. Well, by the grace of God, a couple of weeks later, I had a conversation with a pastor, and that pastor had plans to launch a new campus of his church. He was in a community that we wanted to be a part of, and he presented me with the opportunity to come on staff and allow our churches to merge and help launch that new campus. And it just made sense. We had just been talking about, by the end of the year, unless God does a miracle, like, we're not going to keep going. And then all of a sudden there was this opportunity for a multi-site church to be able to come on staff and help start a new campus. And so that's what we did. A couple of months later, we had our last service. And I thought, maybe God's going to use me to do great things in this church that we had just partnered with. If I'm being honest with you, those were the worst 18 months of my life. I absolutely had a terrible experience and just wanted to leave ministry altogether. If I go back to that question or that statement, my mantra for life, I want to do great things for God, I can tell you I definitely didn't feel like I'd done anything great for God. In fact, I really felt like I had disappointed a lot of people. I felt like I'd let a lot of people down who had given financially, who had given their time, their energy, who had volunteered, who invited people, who led in lots of ways. And I just kind of began to feel like a failure. You may not be able to relate to the failure of starting a church or wanting to do great things for God even, but I bet at the heart of that statement is the statement, I want to do great things. I bet at some point in your life you've wanted to do something great. You've wanted to feel like your life mattered, to have some significance. You've wanted to feel like you were able to excel at something. And what I've come to find is that all of us in our own ways have failures that we kind of carry through life with us. And I was at a place in my life where I allowed myself to begin to believe some lies that began to rob me from the future that God had for me. And so, trigger alert, I want to not just make you feel sorry for me and my failure in life, but I want to help you identify some weight you may be carrying from failures of your own. And so I'm going to put some words on the screen, and there's going to be some tension. But I've been in full-time ministry for 20 years now. And all of these words, I've had conversations with people who have felt like a failure because of them. And maybe your life has been impacted by some of these words as well. Here's the first one: divorce. And you never in your wildest imagination thought that relationship would ever end. And now you're trying to figure out a new reality and how it impacts the kids and all of the complexity that comes with that. And then there's the word abortion. And you can't even talk about it. And I've had people tell me that they have such regret and shame and guilt that they literally can't even talk about that time in their life. Or what about bankruptcy? And you regret some decisions that you made that led to a place that maybe you were embarrassed about or ashamed of. And then there's addiction. This could be sexual, could be physical, could be emotional. Maybe you were, addiction. Maybe it was alcohol. Maybe it was drugs. Maybe it's pornography. Maybe you don't even feel like you can get through a day without your addiction impacting you in some way. And as hard as you try to overcome it, maybe you just find yourself feeling defeated. Or maybe there's adultery. You can't even figure out how it happened. One thing led to another, and now you carry that regret with you. For some, it's DUI, and you got put in the newspaper. And you're trying to figure out how to hide it the best you can and move about life without it impacting you. And then there's abuse. It could be sexual, it could be physical, it could be emotional. Maybe you were the abuser, maybe you were abused. Maybe for some of you, it's hard for you to even classify what your life looks like as abuse. But maybe if you ask the people closest to you, they might describe you as an abuser. And we go through life and we have these things that impact our futures, and we carry the weight of them with us. And we can't figure out how to get past them and the guilt and the shame and the condemnation that we feel. Maybe for you it was a business thing, or maybe for you it was something that was out of your control, something that just happened to you. It wasn't a decision that you made. But I want to ask you a very specific question. It's a question I want you to ask yourself. And it's a question that I actually want you to respond to in a particular way. When you came in today, you should have received one of these cards, hopefully, that just says notes on it. And the question is, what causes me to feel like a failure? What causes me to feel like a failure? And I want you to be brave enough just to write it down. It could be a word or two. You can fold it for privacy. You don't have to write your name on it. But we're going to come back and visit this toward the end of our time together. But as we go through the rest of our time, I want you to think about what is it that causes you to feel like a failure. In my season of failure, through the grace of God, I had some men in my life that really pushed me to get into counseling. That there was healing that needed to take place in my heart. I mean, I was a broken person. I literally felt like a failure, like as a human being, the thing that I set out to do in life didn't work out. It was my greatest dream, and I felt like a failure. And so I started a year-long process of counseling, which I'm so grateful for. But in that process, I came to understand that there were actually some lies about failure that were robbing me of the future that God had for me, that were causing me to see myself in an untrue way. And I learned that the way I felt about myself was being fueled by some lies. And I want to talk about 3 lies with you. And when you think about your failures, your failure, whatever it is that you might put on your card, there's 3 lies that I want to help you see past so that you can experience God's best for your life. The first lie is that my failures define me. My failures define me. You know, I talked about my biblical heroes of the faith that I just looked up to as a kid. And the older I got and began to studying scripture more, I realized that They all had issues as well. I mean, take Moses, right? He was a murderer. And because of his disobedience, he wasn't even able to enter the promised land after he led the children of Israel through the wilderness. I think of Noah, right? Who rescued animal kingdom. He was a drunk and embarrassed his family. I think about King David, who slayed Goliath, one of the greatest kings in Israel's history. And literally, he was an adulterer. He was a murderer. And yet, he went down in history being known as a man after God's own heart. Peter denied Jesus 3 times when he needed him the most. The Apostle Paul gave a portion of his life literally to persecuting Christians. It was his ambition in life to stop this movement of Jesus followers and literally oversaw the death of Christians. And I began to realize that all throughout Scripture and all throughout our lives, there are people who have history and baggage and failures that aren't defined by them. And so I want to read to you a passage of Scripture in Ephesians 2 from the Apostle Paul. It says, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this not from yourselves, is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." I want to pause right there. Your relationship with God wasn't established on anything you did. You didn't earn God's love. You didn't deserve God's love. It's his grace and your faith intersecting. And then he goes on to say, "For we are God's handiwork," which some translations say masterpiece, "created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Like when God thinks of you, he doesn't just see your failures and think, "Oh, I'm so disappointed in them. My plans will never come to pass." Like he knew your end from your beginning. He knew all the failures that you would face in life, and he calls you his handiwork, his masterpiece, his prized possession. And he created you with a purpose in life. And you aren't simply defined by your failures. No, here's your truth for you. I am God's masterpiece. That's your truth. And nothing you can ever do will ever cause God to stop seeing you as his masterpiece. He doesn't hold it over your head. He doesn't threaten you with it. He loves you in spite of it. And it took me a while to realize that God wasn't disappointed in me. And he wasn't mad that I didn't make this church successful for him. But it was just part of his plan for my life. There's a second lie that says, my failures disqualify me. My failures disqualify me. You fill in the blank here. Because of this failure, I can no longer do whatever certain thing that is. When I think about the Apostle Paul, I think of one of the greatest leaders in the Christian faith in the history. Without a question. And I imagine that his life was super smooth. Everything just went right? Because he had the blessing of God on his life and he never faced any hardships or dilemmas. I want to read a portion of 2 Corinthians chapter 11 for you. He says, "I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches." This was a man who had struggles in life. Everything didn't just go right for him. He dealt with a lot of stuff. And you know what he goes on to say? In verse 30 of chapter 11, he says, "If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness." He didn't see worth in like boasting of all the great things that he did for God. He actually saw value in boasting in his weakness. And listen, this is so countercultural for us. You know, I think about the hundreds of you that just joined a small group. And this week, next week, you're going to be getting together with your small group. You're going to be meeting the people in your group. You're going to be sharing your stories, right? Getting to know one another. And you're going to be so tempted to think like, am I wearing the right thing? Is my house clean enough? You know, does it smell just right? You're going to be worried about all those things, right? Because you want to impress the people in your group. And you're going to be tempted to bring the Instagram version of yourself to that group and highlight all the things that you're proud of in your life. And you're not even going to want to talk about your true self. And I want to challenge you to bring your true self to that group, to talk about what's happened in your past that makes you who you are today. And you never know how your courage to be yourself is actually going to impact the people in your group. And it's going to set the tone for your group. And it's not going to be this fake bunch of people just getting together every week and wasting an hour or two. It's going to be people that actually love one another and grow together and build each other up in spite of their failures. Can you imagine if just your small group did that, what an impact it would make on those lives? Imagine what if our entire church did that. I mean, what if our reputation as a church in the city was being the perfect place for imperfect people to attend? I mean, you know how powerful and life transforming that can be? Because here's the truth. People relate more to your failures than they do your successes. And just maybe God has positioned you perfectly to have an impact on other people because of what you've been through. Here's your truth. I'm uniquely qualified to fulfill God's purpose for my life. I am uniquely qualified to fulfill God's purpose for my life. So this past Tuesday, I had the privilege to have a conversation with a pastor in Colorado. I had a conversation with a pastor in Colorado because someone gave them my number and connected us. Because he planted a church. He started a church several years ago. And he doesn't know whether he should close it or not. And he's in a difficult place. He feels discouraged. He feels beaten down. He feels like a failure in some ways. And you've got nothing to share with him, but I know what that feels like. And I may not say anything that'll change his history or his story, but he knows he's not alone. And he knows that he's not a failure by himself. And I believe that God will do in his life what he's done in mine. Which brings me to the third lie that I believe, and that is that my failures are final. It's the end of the story. It doesn't go beyond there. That failure stopped my opportunities in life, and I will just carry it with me forever. It's just not true. And I want to share a couple of conversations that I had. Back in 2011, before we started our church, I looked up Sean C.'s information. He pastored this church called Athens Church, and we needed to drum up some support, and surely they had plenty of money. They can help a struggling church planter, right? Sean was so kind to invite me to learn from the culture of Athens Church. I got to sit in on meetings that I had no business being part of, just to learn. But you know, I'll never forget that lunch where he looked me in the eye across the table and he said, Bronson, you're really courageous. I admire what you're doing, but we're just not going to support you. We're not going to be part of it. And man, what a punch to the gut that was. You know, at least I've got someone to blame now. But I just remember feeling so defeated, like I can't believe he wouldn't just give us something. I mean, in some way help us. And then you fast forward to 2018, and I'm sitting across from him again because in an open position at Athens Church that I've applied for. And in my mind, I went to that meeting and I thought, there's no way he would ever offer me a job. I mean, think about it. Why would he? He's trying to build this church. He wants world-class leaders, and I am far from that. I mean, my ambition at pastoring a church was an utter fail. Why in the world would he invite me to be part of his church? And I'm just telling you, by the grace of God and his goodness in my life, I get to be on this stage preaching in front of more people than I ever did in my own church. And I've got nothing to do with it. So there's this verse in Romans chapter 8 where the Apostle Paul, he says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And here's your last truth. In all things, God is working for my good. In all things, God is working for my good. You never know what your future looks like. But for the grace of God, I'm enjoying ministry more than I ever have in my life. And 5 years ago, I didn't think that was possible. In fact, I wanted to quit ministry altogether. And the same can be true for you. There's hope for your life past your failure. There's a future in store for you. God has purposes and plans for you that you don't even know about. But you can't believe those lies any longer. So here's what I want to do and how I want to end our time together. Hopefully you took your card and you wrote a failure on it. If you haven't, you've got a few seconds to do that now. There should be pens around you. I'm going to ask you to do something really specific with this card in the next few moments. We've got guest services volunteers that are coming, and they're going to be positioned around the room. They're holding boxes. The band's going to come, and they're going to sing some truths over you. And I want to ask you this question again. What causes me to feel like a failure? What are you carrying? What weight? What'd you bring in here with you today? From years ago, from last week, from yesterday? You're going to write them on these cards. And there's nothing magical about this, but just as a sign of faith, just as an act of surrender, as soon as the band starts playing in a minute, I'm going to ask you to courageously step out of your seat and take that failure, and you're going to drop it in that box as a sign that you're letting go. And you're not going to carry that weight along any longer. And then you'll be able to come back to your seat and just let them sing these songs over you and end our time in worship. So if you will, I want to ask you to stand, holding that note. And we're going to out loud together say these three truths. And I hope that you'll believe it and allow it to transform your heart. Will you say these with me? I am God's masterpiece. I am uniquely qualified to fulfill God's purpose for my life. In all things, God is working for my good. Now, I want you to believe this. You don't have to believe the lies of failure anymore. This is truth for you. And we're going to say it one more time, and I want you to use your outside voice, and let's say it like we believe it. And then we're going to sing this song, and you're going to go, and you're going to let go of that failure, and you're going to come back and worship, and God's going to do something in your heart. And your future, your best days are ahead of you. One more time together. I am God's masterpiece. I am uniquely qualified to fulfill God's purpose for my life. In all things, God is working for my good. Let me pray for you. Lord, you know all the failures that are represented on these cards and in the hearts of the men, the women, the students that are in this room. You know the weight that they feel. You know how they carry this burden with them. Maybe there's guilt, maybe there's shame, maybe they feel like they've disappointed someone in their life. But you love each and every one of us, and you call us your masterpiece. And I pray that as they drop these failures into those boxes, that, Father, you would allow the weight that they're carrying to be lifted from them. Father, allow joy to flood their hearts. Allow them to see hope and a future. And I pray that you would bless them. In Jesus' name.